Thomas Carter, a man in his late 70s, sat in his luxury car, a sleek silver BMW, tapping his fingers impatiently against the steering wheel. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the air conditioning struggled to keep the heat of Texas at bay. A retired businessman, Thomas had spent his life in high-stakes deals and had always been accustomed to things going his way. But on this hot afternoon, he found himself stranded on the side of the road with a flat tire, far from his spacious mansion in the suburbs of Austin. After trying and failing to reach roadside assistance, he let out a frustrated sigh, knowing he would have to wait for help. As Thomas sat in his car, the minutes seemed to stretch into hours. Just as his frustration started to rise, he noticed a figure walking toward him from the distance. A young boy, maybe 14 or 15, wearing an old faded t-shirt and scuffed sneakers, was approaching. His stride was confident, and his eyes scanned the car before he gave a slight nod to Thomas. "Flat tire, sir?" the boy asked with a calm, steady voice. Thomas blinked, momentarily taken aback. "Yes," he replied, feeling both relieved and unsettled by the boy's approach. "I could use some help. My phone doesn't have a signal out here." The boy smiled and knelt down next to the tire without hesitation. "I can fix it," he said confidently. "My grandfather showed me how last summer. Do you have a spare tire?" Thomas gestured toward the trunk of the car, watching as the boy opened it and pulled out the necessary tools. The boy worked quickly and efficiently, his hands moving with skill and precision that surprised Thomas. For a moment, Thomas felt a strange sense of humility, something he hadn't experienced in years. "There you go," the boy said after a few minutes, standing back with a satisfied smile on his face. "All done." Thomas reached for his wallet, pulling out a few bills. "Here, take this for your help," he said, holding the money out to the boy. But the boy took a step back, shaking his head. "Thank you, sir, but I don't need anything," the boy said, his voice calm and polite. "I was just happy to help." Stunned, Thomas stood there for a moment, money still in his hand, as the boy turned and walked away without a second thought. As the boy's figure grew smaller in the distance, Thomas felt a strange sense of something missing. He wasn't sure what it was, but the encounter had left an impression on him that he couldn't shake. Later that evening, Thomas sat in his spacious living room, a glass of aged whiskey in his hand. But his mind was elsewhere. He had plenty to think about: business ventures, investments, and meetings with colleagues. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the boy, to his calm demeanor and the quiet pride with which he had worked. The boy's actions had stirred something deep inside Thomas, something he hadn't felt in years: humility. It wasn't the kind of humility that came from being a generous donor, but rather the kind that came from someone who didn't expect anything in return for their kindness. The next morning, Thomas found himself driving down the same road where he had met the boy, scanning the horizon in search of him. It was strange. He didn't even know why he was looking for him. Maybe it was gratitude, or maybe he just wanted to understand the boy's life better. After several hours of asking around, an elderly woman at a local diner finally mentioned the boy's name. "You're looking for Elijah?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "He's always helping people. Lives with his mama over in Willow Creek." "Willow Creek," Thomas repeated, making a note of it. He thanked the woman and immediately set off for the small town. When he arrived in Willow Creek, the town felt like a step back in time. The streets were quiet, lined with simple homes and small businesses. Thomas felt out of place, his shiny car a stark contrast to the modest surroundings. He asked around until he was directed to a small house on the edge of town. It was modest but well kept, with a sagging porch that seemed to speak of years of wear and tear. Thomas hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door. A woman in her early 40s answered, her face warm but worn by years of hard work. She eyed Thomas curiously as he introduced himself. "Good morning," Thomas said, clearing his throat. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I met your son yesterday. Elijah, right?" The woman's expression softened and she smiled gently. "That sounds like my Elijah," she said. "He's always helping folks. Come on in. He's out back working." Thomas stepped inside, the modest surroundings a stark contrast to the grandiose spaces he was used to. The furniture was old but clean, and the walls were adorned with family photos. It felt lived in, real, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. As he stepped into the backyard, he saw Elijah working on a broken fence, his hands moving with a sure, practiced touch. The boy looked up, surprised to see Thomas standing there. "Hey, mister," Elijah said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "What brings you here?" Thomas smiled, feeling an odd mix of excitement and nervousness. "I just wanted to thank you again for helping me yesterday. You did something for me that no one else has done in a long time." Elijah shrugged, the same modesty he had shown before in his eyes. "It wasn't a big deal," he said with a small smile. "I just helped because you needed it." "It may not seem like a big deal to you, but to me, it really was," Thomas replied, his voice serious. "People don't usually help strangers like that without expecting something in return." Elijah paused, his brow furrowing slightly. "I just think if someone needs help, you should give it, no questions asked. That's how I was raised." Thomas stood there for a moment, absorbing the simplicity of Elijah's words. For a moment, he felt as if he were the one learning from the boy. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Elijah," Thomas said with a smile. "Your mother must be very proud of you." Elijah grinned, looking over at the house. "She works hard. I just try to help out where I can." Thomas stood there in silence for a moment, thinking about his own upbringing. He thought about the values his parents had instilled in him: hard work, integrity, and respect. But how somewhere along the way he had lost sight of those things. He'd become consumed by wealth and status. "I'd like to do something for you and your family, Elijah," Thomas said at last, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "You've shown me what really matters, and I want to give something back, something that can make a difference for you all." Elijah's expression turned cautious. "We don't need anything, mister. We're fine." Thomas shook his head. "It's not about need, Elijah. It's about what's right. You helped me, and I want to return the favor." Just then, Elijah's mother stepped out onto the porch, calling for him. "Elijah, come inside and wash up for lunch." She paused when she saw Thomas. "Would you care to join us? It's nothing fancy, but you're welcome." Thomas hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether it was appropriate, but the warmth in her voice left him no room for excuses. "I'd be honored," he replied, following her inside. Inside, the kitchen smelled of freshly baked bread and roasted vegetables. The table was small, surrounded by mismatched chairs, but it was set with care. Thomas took a seat, feeling strangely out of place in his fine suit among the humble surroundings. Elijah joined them, his smile never faltering as he washed his hands and took his seat. His easygoing manner made Thomas feel both at ease and out of place at the same time. As they ate, the conversation flowed naturally. Elijah spoke of his school, his friends, and his dream of becoming an engineer. His mother shared stories about their small community, speaking with quiet pride about how people helped each other. Thomas listened, captivated by the warmth of their words. For all the wealth and success Thomas had accumulated, he couldn't help but feel a pang of emptiness as he sat at this small table, surrounded by people whose lives were so different from his own, yet filled with a depth of connection he'd long forgotten. After the meal, as they cleared the table, Thomas turned to Elijah's mother. "You've done an incredible job raising him," he said. "He's a remarkable boy. You must be so proud." She smiled, her eyes softening with affection. "Thank you. He's been a blessing, even though we've had our struggles. We've learned to appreciate what we have." Thomas paused, contemplating her words. He thought about his own life, his own family, and the things he had taken for granted. He had spent so many years chasing after more money, more success, that he had lost sight of the simple joys of life. He looked at Elijah, a sudden sense of clarity washing over him. "I want to do something for you and your family, Elijah," he said, his voice steady. "I want to give you something that will make a real difference in your lives." Elijah looked hesitant, unsure of what to say. "We're fine, really," he said softly. "We don't need anything." Thomas smiled gently. "It's not about need, Elijah. It's about giving back. You helped me when I needed it, and I want to show my gratitude." Just then, Elijah's mother stepped out onto the porch, calling for him. "Elijah, come inside and wash up for dinner." She paused when she saw Thomas standing there. "Would you like to join us for dinner? It's not fancy, but you're more than welcome." Thomas hesitated for a moment, but the warmth of her invitation was impossible to ignore. "I'd be happy to," he said, following her inside. Dinner was simple but delicious. The warm bread, roasted vegetables, and hearty stew filled the room with an inviting aroma. Thomas sat at the table, feeling like an outsider in the midst of their quiet joy, but also realizing something about himself that he had long ignored. Elijah's mother asked questions about Thomas's life, his work, and his success. She listened attentively, but Thomas found himself talking more about his feelings, the loneliness that had crept into his life despite his wealth. He spoke about how empty his mansion had felt, how disconnected he had become from the things that truly mattered. The conversation shifted naturally, and before long Elijah and his mother were both sharing their dreams, their struggles, and their simple joys. For Thomas, this was a revelation. He had spent so many years building his empire, but he had never learned the true value of connection, of living a life grounded in love and shared purpose. When dinner was over, Thomas stood up, his mind made up. He knew he had to follow through on his promise. This family had given him more than just a meal or a kind gesture. They had reminded him of the values he had lost in his pursuit of wealth. The next morning, Thomas drove out to a local construction company. He had an idea, a way to honor Elijah's kindness, but he knew it would take more than a few small gestures. This was going to require effort, time, and resources. By noon, he had already made a dozen calls. Workers were lined up, contractors were hired, and a plan was in motion. Within a few days, trucks and equipment began arriving at Elijah's home. His mother was in disbelief when she saw the first truck pull up, unsure what to make of it. "What is all this?" she asked, stepping outside, her voice filled with confusion. "You didn't have to do this." Thomas smiled, his expression calm but sincere. "You've done more than manage, you've persevered. And now I want to help you. You've shown me what truly matters. I want to make sure Elijah has the future he deserves." Over the next few weeks, the transformation was remarkable. The sagging porch was replaced with new, sturdy wood. The roof, once leaking, was repaired. The yard, once overgrown with weeds, was landscaped, and a new swing set replaced the broken one Elijah used to play on. Inside, the walls were painted fresh, the floors polished, and the kitchen was completely renovated with modern appliances. Elijah watched the work in awe, his wide eyes full of wonder at the transformation unfolding before him. One day as they were working, one of the contractors, a burly man named Joe, noticed Elijah's curiosity about construction. He invited him over to help measure wood planks, and soon Elijah was asking questions about tools, construction, and the process. "You've got a real interest in this, don't you?" Joe asked with a grin. Elijah nodded enthusiastically, his excitement palpable. "I think you're going to be great at this," Joe added. As the days passed, Elijah's interest in construction grew, and Thomas watched from a distance, proud to see the young boy's passion unfolding. For the first time in years, Thomas felt like he was part of something meaningful. Weeks passed, and the bond between Thomas and Elijah grew stronger. It wasn't just about the construction projects anymore. It was about teaching Elijah skills, sharing stories, and forming a friendship that had begun with nothing more than an act of kindness. One afternoon, as they worked on fixing the fence around the property, Elijah asked Thomas a question that stopped him in his tracks. "Thomas," Elijah began, looking up at him with his curious eyes, "why are you doing all of this for us?" Thomas paused for a moment, the question catching him off guard. He had never really stopped to think about it. "I guess," he started, choosing his words carefully, "I guess I was looking for something. Something that money can't buy. Something real. And I think I found it here." Elijah smiled, his innocence shining through. "I'm glad you're here," he said simply. That moment, so simple yet profound, marked a turning point for Thomas. He realized that in helping others, in creating real connections, he was healing parts of himself that he had long neglected. And it wasn't just Elijah's family that had changed. Thomas was changing too. As the weeks passed, Thomas continued to spend more time with Elijah and his family. He became a regular visitor at their home, offering advice on small projects, mentoring Elijah in various skills, and simply enjoying their company. One day, as they were sitting in the yard, sipping lemonade and watching the sunset, Elijah turned to Thomas again. "Thomas, I want to thank you," Elijah said softly, "not just for the house or the work, but for being here with us, for being my friend." Thomas's eyes softened, and he put a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You're a good kid, Elijah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've taught me more than I could ever teach you." From that day on, their bond became unbreakable. Elijah continued to learn from Thomas, and Thomas continued to learn from Elijah. It was no longer about charity or helping out a poor family. It was about a deep friendship that transcended the walls of class and wealth. As the seasons changed, so did their lives. The house was now a home, filled with love and warmth. Elijah's mother had started a small business, supported by Thomas's encouragement and mentorship, and she was doing better than ever. And Thomas? He found peace. He found something more valuable than anything he had ever bought. He found a sense of belonging, and in doing so, he finally understood what it meant to truly live.